All right, today we're going to tackle something really heavy. We're diving into a historical argument from our sources that is frankly deeply challenging. It puts forward a thesis that draws a straight line from a mystical ideology all the way to one of the greatest catastrophes in human history. So let's just get right into it.
Wow. Okay, so that's the core of it right there. This is the provocative argument we're going to be unpacking. The sources we're looking at claim that a specific mystical movement, one that was centered on the absolute, unquestionable authority of a spiritual leader, actually conditioned its followers to become passive and ultimately completely defenseless. In this explainer, we're going to trace how this ideology started, how it grew, and where our sources say it ultimately led.
So, where does a story like this even begin? Well, according to our sources, it rises from the ashes of an absolute disaster. You see, a massive wave of mystical, messianic hope had totally swept the Jewish world, only to come crashing down in the most spectacular way, leaving this huge spiritual vacuum. A vacuum that was very quickly filled by a new, but maybe not so different kind of fervor.
Okay, let's walk through this timeline, because the sequence of events here is absolutely critical to the whole argument. It all kicks off with a prediction found in the Zohar, a foundational text of Jewish mysticism, pointing to the year 1648. This sets the stage. Then, right on cue, Shabbatai Tzvi emerges, and he's declared the Messiah. And he gets a huge following all across the world. But then, the unthinkable happens. In 1666, he converts to Islam. I mean, you can't even imagine the devastation. It was a spiritual cataclysm. But here's the key point our sources make. That energy, that intense mystical hope, it didn't just evaporate. It had to go somewhere. And the argument is that it got funneled just a few generations later right into the emerging Hasidic movement.
Now, this new movement, according to the sources, brought about a really radical shift in thinking. We're not just talking about a new custom here or a different way of praying. No, this was a fundamental change in the very source of authority itself. The shift was away from objective, written law and toward the will of a charismatic and supposedly infallible leader.
The contrast on this slide really says it all. On the one hand, you have the classical Jewish path, reason, objective law, what's known as halacha, where everyone has access to the texts and is personally responsible for their actions before God. But then, on the other side, you have the rise of what our sources call the cult of the tzaddik. The tzaddik, the righteous one, becomes the absolute center, and his authority isn't based on his scholarship of the law, but on this claim that he has a higher soul. And because of that, his followers owe him total blind submission. His will is the law. And, this image really drives home the consequence of that shift. Once the focus moves from law to the leader's personality, something else happens. You get the rise of what the sources here call a cult of the occult. Followers started to see these leaders as more than just wise teachers. They saw them as figures with almost magical abilities, people who could bend the laws of nature and intervene with God on their behalf.
So with all this new emphasis on the leader's almost supernatural power, certain practices started to become incredibly popular. And our sources argue that these were actually a huge step backward. What was once viewed as, foreign superstition was now being sold as a higher form of devotion.
And at the heart of all this is the concept of a segulot. What is a segulot? Well, it's basically a charm or a magical action. It could be an amulet, a specific ritual you do, maybe a folk remedy you're given, and it's supposed to create a supernatural result. But here's the key. It's believed to work outside of the established system of divine law. It's like a spiritual backdoor. The critique in our sources could not be more blunt. This quote basically calls these practices pagan magic. The argument is that you're no longer trying to serve God by following his laws. Instead, you're trying to manipulate the system. You're trying to perform a kind of magic trick to force a certain outcome, to bend reality, or even God himself, to your will.
And this is where it all leads, according to the argument in these tests. It's the stripping away of your own rational agency. I mean, think about it. If you believe your success, your health, your salvation, if it all depends on some magic charm or the direct intervention of a holy man, well, what happens to your own responsibility, your own need to think, to plan, to take real practical steps in the physical world? It just withers away. It's essentially outsourced.
Along with all these magical practices, the sources point to another central idea that was institutionalized by this movement, the doctrine of Gilgul, or reincarnation. And this, too, had some really profound consequences.
So the idea of Gilgul, reincarnation, it becomes a cornerstone of this whole worldview. It was used to explain everything from why people suffer to why the tzaddik had a higher soul than everyone else. But here's the thing. While it was often presented as this deep, ancient Jewish secret, earlier, very respected rationalist thinkers saw it as something very different.
I mean, this quote is just so powerful. Rav Saadia Gaon, we're talking about one of the absolute giants of medieval Jewish thought, a pillar of rationalism. He didn't just disagree with reincarnation. He dismissed it as delusions and confusions. To him and the entire rationalist school he represented, this was a foreign, pagan idea that had absolutely no place in a true monotheistic faith. So to see it become central, well, that marked another major break with classical Jewish philosophy.
And all of this, all of it, brings us to the final and frankly the most devastating part of the historical argument our sources are making. It's where they connect this entire ideological system, the infallible leader, the magical thinking, the rejection of practical action, to the ultimate catastrophe of the 20th century.
So as the storm clouds were gathering over Europe in the early 20th century, you had practical, worldly solutions being proposed. Things like Zionism, which argued for political action and self-determination to ensure survival. But according to the sources, the leaders of this mystical movement were fiercely against it. Why? Because from their point of view, taking worldly political action was a sign of a lack of faith. It was seen as trying to do God's job for him, instead of trusting in the tzaddik's supernatural power.
And this is the truly terrifying climax of this ideology. The sources argue that followers were literally taught that taking practical, physical steps to save their own lives, to get out, to organize, to fight back, was a kind of heresy. Real faith meant you just waited. You waited passively for a divine miracle, a miracle that would be brought about by the prayers and the spiritual power of your tzaddik. And so we land at the horrible conclusion that's presented in this source material. The ideology no doubt gave people immense spiritual comfort and fortitude, but in the process, the sources argue, it stripped them of their agency, of the practical mindset needed for physical survival, leaving them spiritually strong, but in the real world, physically and completely defenseless.
So the sources leave us with this final haunting question. Could it be that this very same ideology that they claim led to the Spanish expulsion in 1492 and later to the disaster of Shabbatai Zvi, could it also have played a role in the extermination of European Jewry in the Holocaust? It's a provocative question that ties together centuries of history and one to seriously reflect on.